There you are.
All right, we're all
There's
set.
Charles.
Yep, all
Okay.
set.
If you're all set, then I think we can get started.
Sure.
So I want to welcome everyone. I'm Jane Montanaro, Executive Director for Preservation Connecticut, and this is our 7th episode of our Talking About Preservation. And this one we've entitled Saving Faith, because we wanted to focus on historic Black churches, and a starting point for the discussion will be with the Freedom Trail in Connecticut. And we want to discuss how important these organizations are to the community, and the preservation needs of these congregations, and what we can do to help assist bringing resources to those groups. So I want to welcome Todd Levine from the State Historic Preservation Office and Charles Warner from the Dixwell Congregational Church, who are our guests today.
Thank you. Charles is also president of the Connecticut Freedom Trail.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes.
So for those of you who don't know us, Preservation Connecticut was established in 1975 as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, and it was through a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly. And we are the statewide nonprofit historic preservation organization, and we work as statutory partners with the State Historic Preservation Office. And we have several staff members on the call today besides myself. Brad Scheid, one of our circuit riders, Stacy Vero and Mike Farino, circuit riders, and also Chris Wiegren, our deputy director, and Jordan Sorensen, our development director, and I believe Renee Trubert, our preservation services coordinator, is also on the phone, as well as our board chair, Caroline Sloat. I want to welcome all of our staff, and when we open it up for conversation, maybe you'll all get a chance to meet them as well. So we decided to do these weekly chats during this era of COVID to help us continue our mission, because we are, our mission is to be out in the community, fostering preservation in every community in Connecticut. So this is a way for us to take a moment to engage with different audiences, an easy way for folks to drop in and get a chance to meet us and meet our special guests and discuss any preservation issues that they're having in their community. And so we encourage you to ask questions and join the conversation during this noontime chat. So today we are focusing on the Freedom Trail. So Todd Levine of the State Historic Preservation Office will give us an overview of the trail.
Thank you, Jane. So I'm the coordinator for the Freedom Trail. I'm an architectural historian for the State Historic Preservation Office. And I'll share with you a little bit about what the Freedom Trail is and what we do. Share with you our categories on how we place our designated sites within the broader umbrella of what the Freedom Trail is, and then some of our programs. So the Freedom Trail documents and designates sites that embody the struggle for freedom and human dignity and celebrate African American communities. The Freedom Trail was established in 1995 by an act of the Connecticut General Assembly. So having a Connecticut Freedom Trail is a law. When we first started, we had 60 sites in 30 towns. Give me a click. And today we have 145 sites in 60 towns. So we've more than doubled in the last 20 years the amount of sites that we have on the Freedom Trail. Now, when the Freedom Trail was established, it was met with great fanfare. Everybody loved it. We had every time we added a new site to the Freedom Trail, we had all kinds of media attention and newspapers and radio and even TV. And, you know, every time we had a new plaque presented, we have legislators and local leaders there to celebrate these new sites being identified in their communities. There's a lot of great fanfare around new sites being added to the Freedom Trail and the programs that we had. And the most important program that we had in the Freedom Trail in the 90s was that the stories of the Freedom Trail were a part of school curriculum. So schools at that time were teaching local African-American history as a part of their curriculum. Unfortunately, as the time went on, and you can click again, please, as we all know, curriculum changes. Right now we're doing Common Core. There was a couple of changes before that from the 90s. And those stories of the Freedom Trail were phased out. So the good news is about 6 years ago, we launched a program called Bringing the Freedom Trail to Life Through the Arts, where we use kind of a back-end way to get the stories of the Freedom Trail back into school curriculum by using art as the medium to teach history. And we are actually about to release our workbook that we will try to distribute statewide to schools that they can use at their leisure. Click, please. So the Freedom Trail has two main components. We have a website, and then we have our brochure. I will let you know that if you try to go to our website right now, you may be redirected to spam. We've actually been hacked last week, and we've not quite gotten through that yet. But the good news is you can click, Jane, is we are working with a nonprofit organization who's going to be picking up the mantle of running a new website for us and new brochures in the coming months. So click, please. And click again. So I do want to note that the state of Connecticut, State Historic Preservation Office, has 4 museums. And one of our museums is the Prudence Crandall Museum in Canterbury. And this is Prudence and her student, Sarah Harris. And this site is also on the Connecticut Freedom Trail, currently closed because of COVID. There are 4 main categories of the Freedom Trail, and they are the Amistad, Underground Railroad, Concepts of Freedom, and please click, and our newest category, which is Civil Rights and 20th Century Contributions. There is a new national movement that National Park Service, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and certainly the Connecticut SHPO and the Connecticut Freedom Trail are pushing, and that is a change in narrative from not only the African American story to be about overcoming adversity and slavery and getting through civil rights, or coming up to that point in civil rights where the story of African Americans is more than just slavery, Underground Railroad, concepts of freedom. It's about what's happening now. It's about what's happening today. It's about what's happened in the 20th century. So we just added this new category, Civil Rights and 20th Century Contributions. And I'll get to talking a little bit about that in a bit. But it's an exciting shift from the narrative that we've heard before. And I think it's more important now than ever. Click. So one of the most important stories in Connecticut history is the story of the Amistad. And it's not only a story that has to do with Freedom Trail, but it's really, the history of Connecticut and indeed national history. And the short version of the story of the Amistad is in 1839, 53 South Africans were kidnapped from their home, sold into slavery, and on their way to their new home in a plantation in Cuba. When they took control of the vessel and tried to make their way back home to Africa, they kept the navigator alive. They killed the cook and they killed the captain when they took control of the vessel. And the navigator at night changed direction to try to land the vessel in the southern United States where slavery was legal. They ended up getting a little lost, ended up being picked up in a Long Island Sound by the USS Washington, which brought them into New London, where they were originally interned at the New London Custom House. You can click, please. They were jailed in New Haven, and they were tried originally at the Old State House. And this trial went all the way to the Supreme Court, where former President John Quincy Adams represented the Mendis, and now Sierra Leone. And he argued that all men were created equal and won their freedom. Shortened version of that story is much more complicated than that and very interesting. But that's the story of the Amistad, and it happened here in Connecticut. And I'm often asked, who was the hero of this story? Please click. Was it Singay Pie? And here's the Old State House, and here's kids reenacting the actual court hearing. Please click again. Was it the leader of the Mende, we see centered here in this painting, who literally broke free his chains of oppression and fought for his freedom? Was it John Quincy Adams, who argued successfully in the Supreme Court that all men were created equal? Or was it these three little girls? So I mentioned that there was 53 captives, kidnapped Mende, and 3 of them were little girls. So everybody else was chained up, but these 3 were like 8, 9, and 10, and they weren't. They were given free reign to move about the vessel. And the name of the vessel was La Amistad, and that's why this is the Amistad case. But it wasn't a slaver vessel. It was a cargo vessel, so it wasn't made to carry people. It was made to carry cargo, so it wasn't as well equipped to carry slaves. So when these little girls who had free reign of this vessel, they were able to kind of sneak around in the middle of the night. And what they found was cases of sugarcane knives, which were so like the Mende warriors' machetes back home. Now, imagine for a moment, you're a 9-year-old girl, you've just been kidnapped, you're on a vessel of which the likes you've never seen before, surrounded everywhere by water, and you have the courage and the fortitude to sneak around and try to get weapons and equipment to the other captives who you can't really communicate with because you guys are from different tribes. That's what the stories of the Connecticut Freedom Trail represent. Stories of immense courage and overcoming impossible odds. Please click. And one more, please. So the next category I'm going to talk about briefly is the Underground Railroad. This is a site in Farmington. This is the Elijah Lewis House, built 1810. Elijah Lewis was a prominent local citizen and abolitionist of Farmington. In the late 18th century, sheltered fugitive slaves. Please click. There's a lot of interesting facts about the Underground Railroad, not only in Connecticut, but nationally. And one of them, please click, Jane, was that slaves were often hidden in secret compartments. And this is one of the sites where there's said to be a secret compartment that was used to hide slaves. Now, what's interesting is what we found in our research and other people's research is that's not often the case. Most of the time, slaves aren't hiding in special compartments. This is a compartment that does exist at this site. But this is a physical evidence that may or may not actually be evidence of a hiding place for escaping slaves. It could have other uses, like a warming place for next to the fire or behind the fire. The reason why is because this particular area of the chimney in the basement has a big lintel. It would be the opening would be covered with a big stone, which would be very difficult not only to move quickly to hide somebody, but also it would be obvious if you walked by it immediately that there's a doorway here. So how successful this would be for a hiding place is unknown. But I want to share a lot of the other myths that we have about the Underground Railroad. Obviously, the Underground Railroad was neither underground nor a railroad. Some of the myths include that, the workers on the Underground Railroad were white abolitionists. And that's not particularly true. Certainly, in the later portion of the abolitionist movement, there were white conductors. But early on, it was all escaped slaves, free blacks, and actually Native Americans who were the conductors of the Underground Railroad in the North. Another myth is that there were stops of the Underground Railroad in the South, which isn't true at all. Not until you got to the northern states were there a way to access the Underground Railroad. In the South, you were on your own, and especially if you were in the Deep South, you had a long way to travel without very much help to get to the northern states. And one of the things to realize about the Underground Railroad is that, it was a series of stops and safe havens that you used and found shelter on your way to the northernmost states, and particularly to Canada. Canada had in 1833 already made slavery illegal. So that was the promised land to get to Canada. Now, certainly through traveling up north, we have a number of communities here in Connecticut and certainly in other northern states where escaped slaves made Connecticut and these places their home. We have Little Liberia and Bridgeport. New Haven has a number of sites. Norwich has Jail Hill. So there's a number of places where people just said, hey, you know what? I like it here. We're going to stay. One of the things that I think are really important about the myths, and I can go on for a long time, but I won't because we're 20 minutes in. One of the things that we hear about how successful the Underground Railroad is. So there was, it's on the high end, the number of slaves who escaped using the Underground Railroad at the high end is maybe 100,000. In 1860, there was like 3 million slaves. So, it's a fraction of the success the Underground Railroad had in helping slaves escape. So just something to keep in mind when you view the importance of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad really was a romanticized interpretation of how white abolitionists helped, the poor African Americans who needed their help in the 19th century. That's really how the Underground Railroad started to be those stories told. Please click. So our third category is concepts of freedom. Now, concepts of freedom had previously kind of been our catch-all for all other stories on the Freedom Trail until last year. That wasn't the Amistad and wasn't the Underground Railroad. And I should note before I continue is that Farmington was a major hub, not only for the Underground Railroad, but also as in the story of the Amistad. The Amistad captives lived in Farmington while their case was going. And it also was a major hub through Connecticut for the Underground Railroad. There's a number of sites, including Lewis's site, that are well documented to be on the Underground Railroad that are in Farmington. So concepts of freedom is these other stories that talk about great African Americans and white abolitionists, Native Americans who did amazing things for others. And the story I want to tell is the story of Caesar and Lois Peters. Now, this is actually an archaeological preserve in Hebron. The picture you see is a Samuel Peters house, which is right in front of the preserve. Caesar Peters' life was an eventful one. He was purchased as a slave by Mary Peters at the age of 8, and later, as a young man, was sold to her son, the Reverend Samuel Peters, a notorious Tory. So at the time of the Revolution, Samuel Peters bounced right away to England because he didn't want to be in the Americas during the Revolution. After the war, he tried to get his land back. The state of Connecticut took ownership of it. And then he tried to sell off his slaves. So he actually sold off Caesar and Lois, his wife Lois, to a guy named David Pryor from South Carolina. Now, in 1787, Pryor attempted to have his men come up and collect his property. But by this time, Caesar and Lois Peters and their 10 children had become such a part of the community that the community trumped up charges that Caesar owed them money for a tailoring fee, and would not allow them to be taken away. So this is an example of a community rallying around, folks who were a part of the community, and it didn't matter white or black. What matters is they were a part of a community. And the picture you see here is the program that we had a couple years ago with the Bringing of the Freedom Trail to Life Through the Arts, where we brought a bunch of schools over to the Hebron site and did archaeological digs. So we taught kids a little bit about how archaeology works, along with the story of Caesar and Lois. Please click. And the last category we have is our newest category, Civil Rights in the 20th Century Contributions. Our first addition is the Judge Constance Baker Motley Preserve and House, which we added in November 2018, but had the official ceremony last year. Constance and her family lived here for over 40 years, from 1965 to 2005, during which she accomplished her most significant work. Judge Motley became the first African-American woman in the New York State Senate. In 1965, she became the first African-American woman borough president of Manhattan. In 1966, President Lyndon Johnson nominated Mrs. Motley to be the first African-American woman to serve as a federal judge, and the first African-American to serve on the Federal District Court of the Southern District of New York. She served on the court until her death in 2005, including 4 years as a chief judge. Judge Motley was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 1993, and the Connecticut's Women's Hall of Fame in 1998. And in 2001, she was a recipient of the Presidential Citizens Medal. So this is kind of a shift of what we've been celebrating prior to this, and that is that African Americans do amazing things today. Please click. And this is just a shot of the descendants of Judge Motley receiving the plaque at the preserve across the street from the historic house in Chester. So those are the 4 categories of the Connecticut Freedom Trail. And I'll just briefly state a little bit of looking ahead. We are working on a new website, a new brochure, and a new staff person who will be working with us through one of our partner museums, the Old State House, where we'll be able to get somebody out into the field to really hear what the community needs. African-American communities are not being heard, and one of our goals of the Connecticut Freedom Trail is to get our communities of color heard so that we can address their needs in any way we can help. So I'll turn this over now to Charles, president of the Connecticut Freedom Trail.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Oh, you
Good
all
afternoon.
muted. So I am Charles Warner. I am the current chairman of the Connecticut Freedom Trail. I am also a member of the Dixwell Congregational Church. And the Dixwell Congregational Church is, number one, a site on the Connecticut Freedom Trail, but it's also recognized as the oldest African-American congregation in the Congregational denomination. Our friends in Hartford like to dispute that, but we are sort of sister congregations to the Faith Congregational Church in Hartford, which is also tied into the Talcott Street Congregational Church, the historical Talcott Street Congregational Church. So I guess I should talk a little bit about the founding of Dixwell, and then I'll talk a little bit about Congregationalism. Dixwell was founded as an ecclesiastical society. It's one of the steps that you have to take before you become a recognized formal congregational church. And so a gentleman by the name of Simeon Jocelyn, who's from a number of old Connecticut families, he had been a Yale divinity student, and he felt very convicted that it was a big part of his spiritual life as a human to serve the Black population of New Haven. At the time, there were about 800, I guess, free Black people in New Haven, and housing was bad for them. No institution was geared towards their development or welfare, and so he felt like this was his personal mission. So he, along with a group of African American men, got together and established the African Ecclesiastical Society. Now, this I believe predated 1820. However, the records that we have access to show the minutes of a meeting from February the 8th, 1820. Simeon Jocelyn was there, but these men who joined Jocelyn from the Black community were men like William Lanson, who William Lanson was responsible for building the New Haven section, which is about 30 miles of the Farmington Canal. He also was responsible for extending the what is now known as Long Wharf in the New Haven Harbor. It's called Long Wharf because William Lanson cut the stone from East Haven. He invented a way to float the stones from East Haven down the river into the Sound, and he constructed the extension of the wharf. You have men like Prince Duplex. Prince Duplex was the son of a Revolutionary War veteran, also by the name of Prince Duplex, who served as the secretary of the society. Prince Duplex, his daughter was New Haven's first Black teacher, Vashti Duplex Creed. And so these men, also a man by the name of Scipio Augustus, who was a correspondent to the to William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper. So these men that joined Simeon Jocelyn weren't just some random guys. These were men who were prominent in the Black community at the time and very active in obtaining, I suppose, agency, recognition, and rights. There was an early effort amongst this group to petition the state legislature for the right to vote for free Black men. And that came out of efforts from Simeon Jocelyn, but also men like William Lanson, who I mentioned, and another gentleman by the name of Bias Stanley, who was a part of this original ecclesiastical society. From the African Ecclesiastical Society grew the Temple Street Congregational Church, informally known as the African Church or First African Church, but it was an outgrowth of the Ecclesiastical Society, Black members of New Haven's First Congregational Church, also known as Center Church on the Green. Some of their members, they had members. There had become an issue at that church where they were relegated to worshiping in the balcony. And many of them obviously felt unequal and mistreated. And so when the opportunity came to start another church, they left and joined to start Temple Street. Also, the development of the Dixwell Church comes from the church next to First Congregational Church, which is now known as United Church on the Green. Simeon, Jocelyn, and the Jocelyn's were members of congregations, the North Church, and then some others that joined to become the United Congregational Church. So the undertaking was supported by the Congregationalists in general. The Congregationalists were a well-read, a moneyed body. Their style of worship was more appealing towards intellect and reason, and definitely not emotional. And so in terms of African Americans, the population of African American Congregationalists are small, primarily, like I said, started in New England, but the outgrowth across the nation comes out of emancipation. The Congregationalists felt like it was part of their mission work to serve the freedmen of the South, and so many of them went south. Yale graduates, Harvard graduates, and many of the universities that are attached to the Congregationalist Church went down and opened up schools, and then opened up the institutions that became many of the top historically Black colleges and universities. So the early formal undertaking would have been at the Dixwell Congregational Church and simultaneously Talcott Street Church. After Simeon Jocelyn was run out of New Haven for promoting the idea of establishing a Black college, most of the citizens, there was a vote. The vote was like 500 and something to 4 people who supported establishing the college. He was one of the 4. And eventually he was run out of town. There were riots. The members of the church ended up having to serve as bodyguards for him to and from home. And so he ended up moving to Brooklyn, New York, where he was still very active in the freedom movement for Black people and advocating for their rights. After Simeon Jocelyn left, there were men like Amos Beeman and J.W.C. Pennington, who were African Americans, who took the congregation over and became ministers and leaders. And then as you go down the line, you see that many of the people who became leaders of the Dixwell Church had ties to Congregationalism, at first through being up here, interacting with them, and then the next generation, many of those men were benefactors of the education provided by the Congregationalists. So there's this through line from Congregationalism to African Americans and education and higher education, and then a pipeline from those historically Black schools to the Ivy League Congregationalist schools where they went for graduate school and professional training. So men like Albert Miller, for example, who was a former slave and had been a student at a Congregationalist Black school, Fisk University. After he graduated from Fisk, he came to Yale for his graduate degrees and came to the pastorate of Dixwell Church. And also a big part of Congregationalism was missionary work at outposts in the South and in Africa. And so the Amistad story that Todd mentioned earlier, Sinke, who was known as the leader of the Amistad captives went back to Africa to the Mende mission in Sierra Leone. Albert Miller, the gentleman I was just telling you about, did missionary work in Sierra Leone and actually was present at the death of Sankey and preached his funeral. So again, there's this through line through Congregationalism, Black education, and even a relationship to Africa. That has been the sustaining thing for our church and for Black Congregationalists. The universities have served as supply. So as ministers left for greater opportunity in other points across the nation, people drawn to Yale Divinity School and or other studies at Yale became ministers of the Dixwell Congregational Church. Currently, we are celebrating 200 years. Our current pastor is the Reverend Dr. Frederick, known as Jerry Streets. Reverend Streets did his internship at Dixwell as a graduate student at Yale, and for 10 years served as the chaplain of Yale University. And although he is ordained in the Congregationalist Church, he's also a Baptist, and he was the first Baptist to serve as chaplain at Yale University. We have always been in a leadership role in the community. Like I told you from its inception, the people who formed Dixwell were leaders in the community. And I want to share this interesting little piece about becoming the Dixwell Church. The Congregationalists, a predominant white body, oversaw the extension and development of churches that they allowed. And so the people who became the formal first members, and there were 24 of them, had to pass inspection, if you will, be deemed upstanding and of good character, pass an examination based on religious doctrine, but basically needed to be vouched for. So you see the people who formed the church were exceptional and acceptable, but it always attracted a very forward-thinking, active leadership group. And you can see that through line from 1820 to 2020. We have had two Supreme Court justices, and there haven't been many Black ones, but two of them were members of the church. A number of the area's doctors and first graduates of Yale Law School, Black graduates of Yale Law School, and Yale Medical School were all members of the church. There was a big push for education through Simeon Jocelyn and some of those early members. They established the first schools for Blacks in the city. The church also has an institutional doctrine where it's not just a place of worship, but it is also a community center. There were seminars held there. The original church was a way station on the Underground Railroad where people received prayer and food for the first time on their way north. The church had a well baby clinic where mothers could bring their babies and doctors would see them once a week. There was also a fresh milk station for people to come and get, clean, fresh milk. The early church members were very big in the Connecticut Temperance Union and quelling the sale and use of alcohol. Boy Scout, the first Black Boy Scout troops and Girl Scout troops, so anything you all could think of in terms of the Black community in the state and definitely in the city, a lot of it was an outgrowth of what took place at Temple Street / Dixwell Congregational Church. And a lot of the social organizations and national organizations established local chapters in the state through a lot of the work at Dixwell.
Well, Charles, that is such a fascinating history of the church. Thank you so much for sharing so much.
No problem.
information with us. I'm sure you could keep going. I sense your passion and your knowledge, and this is really, really appreciate that you've been doing this with us.
Well, thank you.
We would like to open it up to some questions, and I'll ask the first question. I'd like to know, like, what's the most significant challenge that the church faces right now?
Interesting. We have an aging population. I would say definitely like 60 and above. And when I mean above, I mean there are a lot of people. I'm in my mid-30s, and people I knew who knew me as a baby are still running around. And sometimes I have to count my age and then kind of count their age. And so I'm like, wow, I didn't realize they were in their high 90s. We had, a number of members who were over 100. So our biggest issue now is an aging population, a less churched population in the area. People aren't attending church as much. The purpose of the church is not so necessary. Things are open to, integrated. Number one, integration, so people can find services outside of what was only provided through the church at one time. And then now, COVID. People being so nervous because of our aged population. We meet every week on Fridays for just general checkups and on Fridays. And then the church service is broadcasted on Sunday.
Yeah, those are issues not unique to your congregation as well.
Right.
We've been seeing that pretty frequently around Connecticut. The aging congregations and splitting of some services.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what I'll do is I'll take this down and put the so we can see everyone's faces. And if you have a question, did I stop sharing? Is it back so that everyone can see each other more or less?
Yes.
Okay, good. So don't be shy if you have a question for Charles or for Todd or for
Jane, it's Ed Gerber. How are you?
Hi, Ed. Good. How are you?
Good. Could I ask you a question about the church? Tell us about the building itself.
Okay.
It's fascinating. I've driven by it about 1 million times. One day I'm going to call you and have you bring me on a tour.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. It's funny because I still have to tell people, even from the community, that it's a church because people are like, where? And I describe it, and they're like, yeah, I know the area well. I'm like, the stone castle looking thing. And they're like, oh, yeah, okay. So the second church was at 100 Dixwell Avenue. And so during redevelopment, through Mayor Lee and the Kennedys, in the 60s, it was decided that the church would anchor a kind of renaissance of the community. So there was a shopping plaza, a new library. The community house that used to be next door to us down the street also moved. So there was a huge effort to revitalize the area. And so in 1969, the building opened. But the plan started in 63. And John Johansson is the architect, and he's well known for the brutalist style of architecture. And it's unfortunate because Todd could probably tell you a bit more, but I know there aren't necessarily many standing works of his anymore because it's like a dated style. And so as people modernized, they tore down some of his work. So 1969 was when the building was completed. So almost 51 years.
It looks sort of like those two colleges of Yale, Stiles and Morse, don't you think? I mean, it's not far, right? And
No, it's not far at all. Which is
Together.
also partly strategic The original church was downtown, streets from Yale, on Temple Street, but the Black population was in the Dixwell area primarily at the time, and so the church made a decision to move closer to the people who'd be going there. So again, the relationship between Yale and the church is very strong. A number of the pastors have come out of the divinity school, but many of the white Congregationalists in the early days oversaw the finances, and these were very well thought of men like John G. North, who was a huge insurance magnate in England and here, who I guess the denomination always had someone from the greater Congregational church involved in the finances. And so Yale wasn't far away, and there was a lot of physical interaction between folks from Yale and the church.
Yeah, and I'll just add that last year, the church was added to the National Register.
I have a question. And I'm not that familiar with the list of sites, but are all the sites public sites? No.
No. So, yeah, the Underground Railroad sites, a lot of them were people's private homes, and those are obviously not open to the public. Most of the others, though, are. The Amistad sites that aren't privately owned, you know, there's a number of sites that are that have museums or are museums or have exhibits on either the Amistad or the Underground Railroad, including the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, New Haven Museum, New London Custom House, Farmington Historical Site. There's a whole lot of them that are open to the public and have exhibits. And then there's also, you know, a lot of these sites are either open space. You know, the Judge Motley Preserve in Chester is a preserve, and you can walk it. And same thing for a number of cemeteries. Grove Street Cemetery in New Haven has, you know, maybe 10 different significant African Americans buried.
Well, that's one thing I did notice, that you have a lot of cemeteries, and what makes the cemetery significant enough to be on the list?
So when we started this, we based, well, when it was started, it appeared to have been based on National Register eligibility standards. And then when I came on, I kind of reiterated that 8 years ago. So what we look for the site is we look for a site where that person's significant work happened during the time frame that they lived there. So if there's their house that they were born in, you know, they may have been born in one place and then they spent their adult life where they did their thing, their significant work. That house that they lived in would be the significant place, not their birthplace or their resting place. But if there's nothing left, if we've lost their birth house or the house that they lived at when they did their significant work, and all we have left is their resting place, then that is a site we'll use.
But does it have to be someone who did something significant?
What do you mean?
Well, Tom Nisley probably knows where I'm headed here. We have a cemetery in New Canaan, I think it's Canoe Hill Cemetery, and it has a man there who was a slave, like during the Revolution, and he is buried there. And I didn't realize it till I went back over there the other day, but I think there are 3 others. And he actually is credited with a heroic deed during the Revolutionary War. And we think he lived in the Burwell Morse house that Tom has. But one of the others, I didn't notice this before, it was a lady who, it actually says where she was born, and it's Africa. I don't know anything else about her.
So I would suggest that between maybe you and Tom, that you guys put together a letter of inquiry and send it to me. And then me and Charles will, what's that?
I was asking Tom, would he be interested in that? Tom's muted.
Uh,
Are you muted?
Tom, you're still muted.
Yeah, you muted again.
Thank
There
you.
you go.
Now
You're
I'm
good.
unmuted.
There you go.
I don't believe that he did live in the Hoyt-Burwell
Yeah, we're
house.
not sure about that.
He is certainly buried right next door, right? I mean, you can walk from the backyard into the cemetery. And that is it's very interesting. I didn't know that we had. You're saying we have 3 more?
There are at least 2, but I believe there were 3. But I know that there was a female, and it said she was born in Africa on the tombstone.
Uh-huh.
All right, so why don't we take this offline?
Okay.
Because we're running out of time, and I know the other people have questions. But yeah, we can talk, Tom, and we can talk, Rose. We can talk about putting a letter of inquiry in, and then Charles and I will take a look, and we can. Our goal, by the way, one of the goals of the Freedom Trail is to have a site in every town. So we still have a long ways to go, and I don't know if we have one in New Canaan. I don't remember off the top of my head.
Well, one way or another, he's supposed to be the last slave who died in Connecticut.
Okay. All right, well, we'll talk offline, Tom, because we only got 7 minutes.
We'll follow that up.
Yeah, please.
So we have a question in the chats that I wanted to bring up for you guys. How many Freedom Trail sites actually have a physical plaque? All of them, so that they're marked for people walking by?
Yeah, so not all of them. I would say, probably 75% of them do. Every time I come across a site that does not have a plaque, I give them a plaque. We want people to be proud of being on the Freedom Trail, and certainly all the organizations that are nonprofits or open to the public, they have plaques. So if anybody is on the line here that's on the Freedom Trail and doesn't have a plaque, let me know. We'll get you one.
Another question from Leah Glazer. She wanted to know what would be the incentives for listing a historically Black church on the National Register. Would there be grants? We know that there are, but can you just sort of expand on those a little bit? Marina gave a link in the chat, but if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Marina. That's a great question, and there are benefits. And because a church, Black or otherwise, is a nonprofit 501c3, if you're listed on the state or national register, you're eligible to take advantage of our grants. So we have 2 main grant lines. One is for soft costs like conditions assessments or architectural drawings and specs, and the other one is for capital improvement, which could be roofs, could be windows, and there's all kinds of opportunities for churches to take advantage of state funding to do improvements to their building. So there are indeed incentives. If anybody has any questions, you can go to our website. Marina just put up a link, or you can just reach out to me, and I'll put you in charge of my colleagues that run those.
Todd, would you mind, could you share about the recent grant that you all have been helping churches with, or nonprofits with, in terms of supporting people through COVID?
Oh, right. So we actually just launched this through COVID, a stewardship grant that's non-matching, up to $1,000 for any nonprofit that has an historic building that's on the state or national register, just for maintenance and upkeep. Right now, if congregations don't have people coming in, they're not having income coming in, but they still got to keep their grass short, or they still got to deal with electric bills or taxes or whatever. So this is a grant that you can link on our website, and I think Marina, thank you, just put it up, the Stewardship Relief Grant. And again, it's $1,000, up to $1,000 for, you have to show that you expended those funding. But through this whole period of COVID, you get reimbursed that money. So it's a great point. Thank you, Charles, for raising it.
In Preservation Connecticut, we have the team of circuit riders. Stacey Vero is one, Mike Farino, Brad Scheid. And our circuit riders come out and visit congregations. Even in this time of COVID, we've been doing some selective site visits, especially if the building is currently unoccupied and it's a small group. But circuit riders will make a site visit and talk to you about the preservation needs of your church and let you know of all of these grant opportunities that are available and help with grant applications, help identify scope of work, help identify consultants, and really help walk you through the process of any of these grant programs.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. And the first step, is always, documentation. Is it eligible for listing if it's not already listed? And Preservation Connecticut can help get you guys, get these churches listed if they're not already. And that's always the first and most important step so that you can have access to these other grants.
Catherine, do you have a question? You're muted. Can you put it in the chat?
She did. She said, as we think of
okay.
additional Freedom Trail locations, we should be keeping in mind the criteria for 20th century sites. And we do, and we have. We've changed our criteria for National Register only eligible sites to include new sites. And in fact, we changed that a couple of years ago. We added the Freedom Bell in Norwich, which was just a newly built memorial to the Freedom Trail. There's a new memorial in Simsbury that's going to be built by kids for Martin Luther King that when it's completed will be unveiled on the Freedom Trail. And in fact, that reminds me of a program that our office is working on. We got a federal grant to research Martin Luther King's period in Simsbury. While he was at Morehouse College, they had a program where they sent students out to earn money. And he came up here for 2 summers in the 50s to work in tobacco fields in Simsbury. And he wrote 5 letters back home stating how instrumental his time in Connecticut was to become the man that he became. He said that, this is the ideal where I can go to any restaurant. I can go to a movie, any movie theater I want. I can eat at places that whites eat at. And that really was, and he stated in his letters that this is a factor in him becoming the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. So it's a really important research program that our office is doing in partnership with the National Park Service. We're really excited about it, and that launches probably out next year.
And also in September, on September the 26th in New Haven, the Amistad Committee and the City of New Haven will be unveiling and dedicating a new statue. And the statue is in honor of William Lanson, who I mentioned earlier was one of the early founders of what became Dixwell Church because of his physical and figurative building of the city of New Haven. The city is building a statue in his honor, and we will also be inducting that to the Connecticut Freedom Trail.
Great, that's terrific. Thank you. We are at 1 o'clock. If anyone wanted to ask a question.
We have
One more.
Catherine's question. Sorry, she was able to get through on chat, so I don't know if you want to.
I know one of the things that Ms. Catherine said, I mentioned some of our historical ties. Ms. Catherine's family is generationally deep at the Temple Street Church and the Dixwell Church. Timothy Caesar, an ancestor of hers, is another Revolutionary War veteran and African American. About 5 subsequent generations of his are affiliated with the Dixwell Church, and Miss Catherine has been affiliated with us and working on historical things, and she presented us with a document given to her by the President of the United States, by President Obama. She gave it to the church in recognition of Timothy Caesar's service in the Revolutionary War. And not long ago, we also had a ceremony at the Grove Street Cemetery, which is also a Freedom Trail site, for Timothy Caesar, who you can see in her picture box. Miss Catherine is also related to the famed William Grimes, who wrote what is known as the first autobiography of an escaped slave. And she was here for us honoring him as well. And William Grimes's burial site is a Connecticut Freedom Trail site.
In the Grove Street Cemetery.
Yes, at the Grove Street Cemetery.
So the ancestor that she was asking the question about is already on the Freedom Trail?
No, not Timothy Caesar,
Okay.
but where the Caesar and Grimes family is buried, it's a family, like a family plot. And so we dedicated that plot in the name of William Grimes as a separate site of itself, although the Grove Street Cemetery where he's buried is also a site. William Grimes, for his own achievement, was inducted into the Freedom Trail. But Timothy Caesar, with his achievements, was also recognized through the efforts of Miss Catherine, not the Freedom Trail. He was recognized by the military for his.
So I would just suggest, Catherine, that you send me and Charles a letter of inquiry for inclusion. Just, a one-page paragraph or two about his life, and we'll share it with our committee to get the green light for you to move forward with a full application. And we can get him at it.
Jane, this is
A great webinar. Thank you.
Oh. Jane, could I ask one more question?
Sure.
This is a little off subject. It's for Charles. My father opened a business in 1940, not too far from the church, from the Dixwell Avenue Congregational United Church of Christ, and his landlord was a famous minister by the name of Daddy Grace, United House of Prayer. Do you know him? Did you know of him?
I know of Daddy Grace. Everyone knows of Daddy Grace.
Yes,
However, the House of Prayer,
Yes.
which is the church, is still there, and that is where the old church was. So when we moved, they tore down our old church, and House of Prayer has like a modern edifice in the area of our old church.
He told me many times of the story of when he first rented the place. Daddy Grace arrived in a big limousine
Yes.
with a lot of children beautifully dressed. He got out with long flowing white hair, and
Yes.
he said, "Mr. Gerber, I am your landlord, and if you pay your rent, everything will be fine. And if you don't pay your rent," he points down, "you're going down."
I believe it.
With these long fingernails, he was quite imposing.
Yes.
Dad paid rent.
I'm sure. I bet. Yes, I've heard stories from people who were around. Yes.
Well, thank you, Ed, for sharing that.